As an enormous Hellblade fan, I wanted so badly for the sequel to be a dream game for me. I played the first game in 2017 on PC in the month that it released, and I described it at the time as, quote, one of the absolute best games I've ever played. I also described it at the time as an absolute masterpiece, praising the creativity, writing, voice acting, emotion capture, combat, and the graphics. I claimed the game was a 10 out of 10. And then 2 years later, I played through it again and still described it as one of my all-time favorite games. By 2020, I had played through Hellblade 1 3 times, and all of those playthroughs were on Steam, and from the very beginning of Hellblade 2's marketing, I was heavily invested. The early cinematic trailers that seemed too good to be true, and then the trailer that was just mostly audio and dialogue, and Senua sort of standing in a room. I was always gripped by the reveals and just wanted to see more. It honestly wasn't until 2024 that I started to sense things that were concerning about the game. And as the previews landed and then the reviews, and then I spent some of my own time in the game, I made a video calling it a regressive disappointment. But was I wrong? Did more time in the game change my mind? Sadly, no. It actually got worse. After rolling credits on this game, I found all of the major pieces incredibly lacking compared to the first game. The combat being the worst offender, and I'm going to have some analysis of that even in this video, more analysis than even my previous video. But the puzzles in the story are both also just incredibly lackluster and disappointing. Now, every weekday here on Reforge Gaming, I tell you what I think about a gaming topic, and then we go to a live stream where I want to hear what you think. So, if you want more content like this, be sure to hit subscribe. And in this video, I'm going to start with the combat, because that is where most of the confusion exists. Many people are completely misrepresenting the first game when it comes to combat, and as a huge fan of Hellblade, it has been very frustrating to watch. Then, I want to talk about the puzzles, because that was another major aspect of the first game alongside of the combat. And the puzzles, once understood how they work, they land in a very similar theme as the rest of the game, and it's not good. Then I will talk about the story, as I do think there are good things here, but poignant moments are completely ruined by the delivery and the other elements. Lastly, I will give you my conclusion about all of this, and this continues to get drugged down into a console tribalist fight, which has no bearing on my enjoyment of Hellblade 1 versus 2, as I have played them both on Steam. I spent much of last year defending Hellblade 2 trailers against what I felt was unfair hate and criticism. I kicked off this year with a stream about my most anticipated games of 2024, and Hellblade 2 was at the top of that list. There isn't even a video that I want to make like this. I didn't want to make this video, but given my love for the game, it just felt wrong to leave the coverage somewhat incomplete. So, let's start with the combat. I attempted in my last video to give concrete reasons why the combat felt so bad in this game compared to the first, and basically I have concluded that many, not all, but many of the people who enjoy the combat in Hellblade 2, they don't realize how much they aren't actually doing. I truly think many people are so immersed that they think they're driving the combat, even though they are not. So, if you haven't seen that video, I'm just going to give you a quick summary here, because I think it's important. Nothing in this game is fluid, and everything is scripted when it comes to the combat. Combat is basically something that boils down to waiting for them to swing, you get a perfect parry, and then you slash them to weaken them, or you end up executing them. It is so disjointed, it is so bland and repetitive, I ended up loathing any combat sections that I had to engage with. The perfect parries are mini cinematics. The executions are mini cinematics. The only thing that you feel like you're actually controlling is the light swing, heavy swing, or dodge. And it's the most effective to just wait for the parries, because if you try to initiate your own timing of swings or running, so much of the game feels scripted that it doesn't really allow for that fluidity and that player agency. And then the blocks and the parries, well, they're all attached to these sort of micro moments where you're not really in control, because once the parry initiates, it zooms in, you're waiting, and now it's time for you to either swing or execute. And since every fight is a 1v1, longer fights become tiresome, daisy-chained encounters where almost every single enemy that you fight gets to smack you, punch you, or grab you before the fight even starts. It's exhausting, and by the end of the game, I just wanted it to be over. But it's far worse than just being a sequence of mini QuickTime events. It is combat that is not combat. So many of the encounters are so heavily scripted, it feels like those opening cinematics of a game where you just sort of periodically have to hit a button. I can't stress how uninvolved the player truly is in the combat sections. I even had a sequence where there was a scripted grab. 2 enemies grab you, and you kick off the first enemy, and then you elbow the second. And it was the exact same sequence from a fight that I had just gotten into 5 minutes prior. With how little combat is even in the game and how heavily scripted it is, I was shocked how many times they just reused animations and fight setups. I hate using this word. I do not like using this word for game development, but it just started to feel lazy and very phoned in. And then the lack of good boss fights is just baffling. Hellblade 1 has numerous and great boss fights. Valravn, Surt, Fenrir, and Hela are all unique, iconic, and powerful encounters. The game, basically, in this game, doesn't have boss fights. That famous cave scene, it's actually in the game. I was surprised. Now, it has been somewhat reined in and dumbed down graphically, but it's just a giant QuickTime event where they go into the cave and get the giant to chase them out, and you throw spears a couple of times that had no impact on the outcome of the fight. You're basically just along for the ride. You're not doing anything. Then there were 2 of the bigger and more cinematically impressive boss fights, but they were basically the same as each other. You just run from cover to cover so that you don't get burned in the one fight, and then in the other one, you run from cover to cover and you grab on so that you don't get washed away. It just lands so flat because it's so mechanically driven, unlike the boss fights in the first game that were combat driven. And the final boss fight is so anticlimactic because it's just another long drawn out fight against a man where you're swinging and parrying and not really in control of what's going on. I didn't even record it. I just wanted to be done with the game by the time I got to that point. It's also probably the only part of the story that has somewhat of a decent twist and a good revelation, so I don't want to spoil that. Now, after playing through this entire game, my opinion on combat only grew worse. The combat is not driven by player agency. You are simply pressing buttons to trigger scripted sequences, and the number of times you get punched, slapped, grabbed, or tackled to lead to the next enemy fight, it is nauseatingly overused. Those who keep saying that this combat is the exact same as the first game, they either haven't played the first game or they lack the discernment to see the crazy amount of differences and just how bad this combat is when compared to the first game. So, that's the combat. What about the puzzles? When it comes to the puzzles in this game, it's not that they're bad, it's that they aren't any good. They are all inherently the same. You either look at these orbs to flip sections of the world upside down to open or close certain pathways, or you are lighting torches that essentially do the exact same thing. Now, there are the ones from the first game where you're looking for symbols in the world from the right perspective, and those are typically pretty enjoyable, but they're not any different from the first game, and there's really not very many of them. I honestly thought finding the faces in the world, that was the coolest sort of puzzle thing visually. I thought that was brilliantly executed, but they're just pretty obvious, and they would only lead to a bit of audio lore. They weren't really part of any of the puzzles. For the most part, the puzzle sections were either the orbs or the torches, and all you're trying to do is open and close pathways to get through. That's it. And if I were to attempt to diagnose what went wrong here, it's the same thing that went wrong with the combat. Presentation became the primary focus, so the execution ends up being bland, repetitive, drawn out, and boring. Just like the lengthy fight sections, the puzzle sections overstay their welcome, especially when you can see the solution so quickly for a lot of them, yet you then have to tediously walk around, climb up, climb back down, and head back to the thing that you have now opened. Solving a puzzle doesn't feel satisfying, as it feels more like a time sink just to get a door open. The first game had puzzles that made you rethink the space that you were in as you would change the layout of a room or a pathway. Hellblade 2 makes it so you can kind of faintly see the structure or the thing that you're removing or adding, so the element of illusion is gone, and solving a puzzle is just sort of a matter of doing it rather than figuring it out or deducing the solution. I can't tell you how many times I said, oh, I see it, almost right away, and then I just had to sort of go through the numerous steps to get through the puzzle, so it doesn't feel like you're solving anything. This was past the halfway point of the game as well, and that's when I would expect things to maybe get a little bit more challenging. The only time a puzzle took a long time is because you had to reroute and go back through steps, and if you misplaced something, you had to like redo it. It was tedious. It did not feel good to engage with. Again, I think presentation took so much priority here. The environments, the lighting, and the setup for so many of the puzzles, it was awesome. They looked great. The end of one of the puzzles, it was honestly a great spectacle of just how pretty this game is. But like everything else in Hellblade 2, the journey is just so overindulged and drawn out that it robs the potential good moments of all of their power. And if there's ever a time that was more true, it's in the story. This is probably where I will be the most nuanced, but I still will remain fairly critical. I will also avoid spoilers, which isn't too difficult given nothing major happens in this game, and the biggest twist isn't really even worth mentioning. So what does the story get right? Well, for starters, they do spend a good chunk of the early parts in the game pulling in threads from the first game. The voices in Senua's head are familiar, and yet they don't seem as potent in Senua's mind. The deep, earthy, and terrifying rumble of her father's voice is once again very effective at haunting and provoking Senua. And the way they brought Dillion and the past back to center stage, it was a really great springboard into a new story for Senua. But as it progresses, two things happen that really hurt it. First, the pacing honestly gets worse and worse the more you play. When folks tease this game about the amount of walking, they're not exaggerating. They are not taking a cheap shot. The walking becomes almost obnoxious at times, as it just serves as padding and time for the characters to talk. Now that's fine in a game with more length, but for a game where clear times are ranging from 5 to 7 hours, so much of that time feels wasted. There were times where I literally just sort of shrugged and said, well, I guess it's time to walk another mile and listen to a bit of dialogue. But the second thing that goes really, really wrong is not just the pacing, it's the delivery. One section was especially egregious because it was literally done in slow motion. If you thought walking or lightly jogging for long distances was bad, wait until you have to do it in slow-mo, and for a long time. And the infuriating thing was they were doing this for major story beats and lore and narrative pieces, but it's so boringly executed. Apathy always managed to creep in, and I would just find myself saying, all right, could we just sort of get on with it? It's kind of like if you were to listen to a very interesting lecture, but the professor was just monotone or very flat-voiced. The subject matter loses its power when it's delivered in such a boring way. And the last and final part of the storytelling that I found to be poorly done is how it feels like it repeats itself. Now, I'm going to keep this generic to avoid spoilers, but this happened so many times that eventually I was just kind of rolling my eyes, like I knew what was coming. They would set up a scenario, and Senua was not really sure what's happening or how to proceed. The voices in her head would debate about if she could figure it out or not, and then they'd get scared because things were looking bad, or maybe you have to get in a fight. And then they would start blaming her for how poorly something might have gone, or if somebody died or got hurt. This loop of story happened so many times that the last time it happened and the voices started blaming and yelling at Senua, I found myself just wanting to say, shut up. Like, how many times are we going to do this? It just doesn't translate to a story that feels like it goes anywhere, because each chapter feels so much like the others. You go to a place, You got to solve some puzzles to get where you want to go, to get through, and then you get in these very scripted, repetitive fights, and then you got to stop the big bad from being a big bad, and then you long walk to the next section. Everything has the same irritating character traits. The story elements are just like the puzzles in the combat. They're drawn out, they're slow, they're overindulgent, and they're repetitive. And it makes the few strong or poignant moments just land flat. I don't feel like Senua or any of the supporting characters change or grow in any significant ways. In the first game, Senua goes from skittish and manic to more confident and strong. And in this game, the voices in her head, they tend to just sort of hit the same notes each chapter, and so does Senua. It's a bit of confusion with a splash of doubt, and then it's always crescendoed in sort of angry confidence coupled with weird self-talk of blame. And it never really changes. Even as the game concludes, I don't really have a clear picture of what happened to Senua, other than that she leveraged her pain and her darkness to help others, which I love that as a message and a theme. It just lacks the gut-punching fear and honesty of the first game. It just turns Senua into a hero that ebbs from confident to somewhat doubtful and then back to confident. The raw intensity of the first game is gone, and in its place we have a very neutered story where, after all is said and done, very little actually happened. And I think the reason for that is the first game was so clearly about overcoming obstacles for her own personal journey. She had to grow. She had to get stronger. She had to overcome those things. And the sequel feels more like a quest-oriented game where you're just sort of going and helping people do things, and it's always very similar to the last thing that you did. We have to go and stop these big scary things from being big and scary. It's also just far too grounded in the real world. The first game, you're not really sure if any of it's real, right? Did we actually fight Valravn? Did we actually go to hell? And I wouldn't have been bothered by a game more grounded in the real world if the story would have been more meaningful for Senua as a character and less about just leveraging her as a more typical main protagonist. So, what's my conclusion after all of this? If I didn't love the first game as much as I do, this video would not exist. Finishing the game and making this review felt necessary after I spent so much time in Hellblade 1 and looking forward to the second game. I didn't want to turn around in a few months and feel like I left all the questions unanswered or all the criticisms left unsaid. And it makes me sad to create a video like this. I don't want Ninja Theory or Melina Juergens to see videos like this because I genuinely like them and I love what they accomplished with the first game. And it's especially frustrating that this constantly gets dragged into a childish console war. I love Hellblade 1 and the story and the character and the journey. It means a lot to me personally, and honestly, there are parts of Hellblade 2 that still resonate and really speak to all that I've been through in my real life. But everything I wrote and said about this game in this video, it really comes from a place of just genuine honesty and disappointment. My one hope is that they feel similarly about how the story and the character of Senua progressed, and that they end up making a third game one day, and then just get back to their roots of what made the first game so good. Because I still love Hellblade, and I still love Senua, and I want the franchise to go out on a high note, which is probably the best thing I could say about Hellblade 2. It's not so bad that they wouldn't make a third game, right? It is being praised for a lot of the things it gets right. It's technically very strong. I mean, that's undeniable, but that's pretty much where the praise from me ends. So as I want them to have a future. Ninja Theory, I want Hellblade to have a future, so long as Xbox thinks the studio and the game are deserving of a future, which for now I think that's a giant question mark. Just because I think Hellblade deserves another game doesn't mean Xbox or Ninja Theory agrees with me. But those are just my thoughts. Now it's time to hear your thoughts, and you can do that in a comment below, or you can come to the live stream. There'll be a card right here at the end of the video. There's also a link typically pinned in a comment below. And if you like this content and you want more like it, please remember to like, share, and subscribe.